Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.
Kale, as men los da kala lein par der Chippe, kimmen bei yossi-chajes und trugen sie weg.
Kommen, neue Macht, Lo Hashem, nicht Gott, nicht durch Gott, durch wemen. Teufel! 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 Kim, ich beschwör dich! Helf mir! Heide, 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 Nimm dir mein Guf, nimm dir meine Schuhe, nimm dir mein Chochme, nimm dir mein Teure, nur gib mir sie, gib mir die Psyle, Leje Baschano. Heide, 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 Vor mir entpflegt sich der Sott in zweifachig ausgedrückten Schem. Ich seh ihm, ich hab wieder mein Erzählt geweint. Аю, in der Ona, wie in der heute nicht geborene Ona, sei verloren.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me is Mr. John Walker.
By using numbers for letters, I seek to become a cofactor in the mystic powers that rule the world.
Also with us this week is Mr. Daniel Bird.
Hello.
This week we are looking at the 1937 film The Dybbuk, directed by Michal-Waszynski, and one of many adaptations of Shalom-ansky's play. The film tells the tale of a young couple who are fated to be together by their father's promise. When that promise is broken or forgotten, some bad things happen. Now, this film is almost 80 years old, so, spoiler alert, I guess. Good luck with that. Anyway, Daniel, when was the first time that you saw The Dybbuk, and what did you think?
I first saw The Dybbuk in, I guess, the early 2000s. I'd just come to Warsaw as a student. I started going to the theatre in Warsaw. One of the more interesting theatres was called Teatr Rozmaitości, Variety Theatre. And the star director at the time, a guy called Krzysztof Walikowski, did a play which kind of intercut two texts. The Dybbuk, based on Ansky, and also I think it was a text by Hannah Krall. That was the first time I'd really kind of heard of the concept, to be honest. I did some research and realized that obviously there was a play and also a film. So I read the play and looked at the film, and it kind of, it blew me away in many ways, because although it was often considered, and often is considered, a kind of a Yiddish film, of course it's a Yiddish-language film, a Polish-Jewish film, and it was very different from what you usually think of when you think of like the history of Polish cinema, and it opened the door to this whole other chapter of kind of Yiddish-language cinema in Poland before the war. What I liked about it, first and foremost, was that it was a fantastic film. I mean, it's a ghost story. But it's also a musical, and so it's got several genres at once, and it's a kind of a doom romance. And it's got like the courtroom scene at the end, and and it kind of brings together all these kind of influences of German expressionism and things like that, and it's never kind of gone away. I mean, I've never kind of looked into it into detail, but it's a film which is always kind of hung around like a ghost, appropriately enough. So it's a great opportunity to return to it.
John, when was the first time you saw it?
At one point, we were talking about me coming on this show, and you sent me a list of a few films, and the name jumped out at me because it was one that I had read a bit about, and I had sort of boned up on some of the folklore behind Dybbuks and golems and all that stuff, but I had never seen the film. So for me, it was a great excuse to sit down and really spend time learning about this movie that I sort of knew I should have seen before. And as far as what I thought of it, I'm a big horror fan, so I always look at these older films that were creepy or supernatural with an eye towards that, like how's the atmosphere and what kind of mood is it striking. I was really kind of drawn into the kind of old world mysticism of that aspect of it. And I will say this as a kind of a comforting thought about an older film like this, as slow-paced as it can be, and as simple as the plot can seem to be kind of stretched over that time. After seeing the Dybbuk, I was like, I just want to check up. And so I picked a recent film from 2012 called The Possession, which is also a Dybbuk, possession movie. And it was so hacky and shallow, it really made me appreciate, again, just the time spent with one of these old slow-paced films where the visuals are going to, take a while for you to kind of let them soak in and everything, but it's a much more rewarding experience than this same subject matter would be treated today. So I really enjoyed it as a horror film, and as Daniel was alluding to, the mixed genre aspect of it. It's a really interesting mix of things, and I think that nowadays that subject matter would be treated in a more one-track, simplified way.
I saw this one on Daniel's recommendation. I was very fascinated by the film, not even as far as it being a horror movie or a mixed genre type of thing. I just enjoy looking at older films sometimes from more of a cultural point of view, and just seeing the society that it was portraying, at the rituals. I found that very interesting to see how that was, and then also know that it was through a lens of Polish cinema in 1937, based on a play from 1905, which was based on stories from much earlier than that. So I found that very interesting to see the way that things were being put together that way. And I didn't necessarily mind the slower pace. The only complaint that I had really was just the subtitles. I mean, at first I thought there was no way I was going to be able to watch this film, because the first 10 minutes of it or so, there's a little bit of subtitles to, there's a prologue to let us know kind of what's going on. There's a little bit of a scroll at the beginning to let us know what's happening. But then the first scene that takes place at a synagogue, there's no subtitles whatsoever. And these people are just chatting to one another. And it seems like they're saying some very important things, but I have no idea what's being said. Thank goodness for Wikipedia, which tells me kind of more of what the play is saying versus the film, but at least I'm kind of getting an idea of what they might be talking about in this.
Yes, in terms of a synopsis, I had read the Wikipedia page about the play. I'd hoped to find time to read the play before having this conversation, but I wasn't able to. But I think between that and just what I knew about the movie's story, I was able to kind of put it together, and the occasional word would sneak through that I know. It's just disappointing because you're into the movie and you're into the atmosphere of the film, and you want to find out whatever facts were on the screen for you to glean. And for instance, that opening scene, the whole relationship between the two friends, Cinder and Nissan, is established in their dialogue in those scenes. And you can tell from the way these guys are acting that these are the happiest friends ever. But you don't really know the text of what they're talking about. So I did feel a little bit bereft of that content, too.
There is a very interesting difference between the film and the play, and the way that you have... I mean, it's not until really an hour into the film that the possession story really kind of kicks in. What you have in the film, which is kind of implied and described but not actually shown in the play, is this whole relationship. And so, I mean, it really, it's like an entire backstory at the beginning of the film. But in terms of the actual content, I mean, I think that having read the play, I mean, a lot of the dialogue which does appear in those kind of subtitles are more kind of plot points, and everything else. A lot of the content of those kind of early acts in the play, it is introducing this kind of cultural life, the kind of the myth, the kind of the religious aspects and various kind of mythological components, and it's texture. It's kind of plunging you into this kind of world where magic exists.
Getting back to the two friends, I mean, I could definitely see what you were talking about, John, when it came to these guys being pals and everything. And it feels like they want to say something to the rabbi who's leading everything, but things keep getting in the way is what I was kind of taking away from it. And then there's this character that I believe they call the messenger, and he is just a fascinating character to me. This really spooky dude who's just hanging out on the outskirts, and every time he says something, people react in a very bad way. And that character was great to me, and I also love that he doesn't seem to change. He seems like he's this eternal figure that is always going to be on the outskirts, and he seems to be kind of warning everybody about stuff. And it isn't until I think we do get some subtitles because we are in the synagogue for a while, and then we finally get out. They take a little trip. They sing a song, and one of many songs in the films. And I know, too, when it comes to films from this era, there were a lot of times where the songs were just expected. You know, you were getting a whole variety act when it came to any sort of movie. I mean, looking at a lot of films from this time, there are often song breaks. You know, it's kind of expected that you're going to have at least one musical interlude, if not two, if not three, during this time. So it was neat to see how they worked that into the film as well. And here, the song that I think is it Sender that he sings? Or is it? No, sorry, it's Nissan, I think.
Nissan, yeah.
The one that he sings actually becomes a plot point later on in the film when somebody else is singing that song, and it's like, oh, that was my friend's song. It's kind of neat too, because the two characters, Nissan and Sender, eventually Nissan dies in this really elaborate storm sequence, and Sender, it looks like it's the same actor who plays Sender when he's older, but he just has like the big beard and everything on, so he's got this really young face with this big beard on. But it worked for me, you know, it definitely worked, because there were a lot of very authentic big beards in this film.
The fact that it was the same actor really helped me make sure that I was correct that it was the same character, because that's another kind of casualty of not hearing what people, or not understanding, I should say, what people were saying in that opening scene. So because I recognized that guy. He had a real, I don't know, a very memorable kind of bone structure to his face, the guy that played Sender. Before we leave the subject of the messenger, though, I do want to mention, it took me a minute to decide that we were supposed to recognize him as like fading in and fading out. Now, obviously, as the film goes on, there's lots of like double exposure tricks like that. But the very first scene where the messenger kind of fades into view, I wasn't sure if that was just the way I saw that, or if we were supposed to believe that he magically appeared. But it very quickly becomes apparent that he has like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers level teleportation abilities, where he can just kind of pop up wherever people can be most frightened by him. I thought he was interesting. The write-up of the film mentioned him as a sinister character. I saw him more as that kind of just outside the ways of man, not quite sinister, but just he's bringing the wisdom that kind of lies outside the world of these people, or, you know, that's part of the mysticism that they adhere to. But they still, like, they believe what he's speaking is the truth, but they also are scared to see him when he pops up, because, like you said, Mike, it's never good news when the divine creeper shows up.
One of the interesting aspects about the film is that it kind of grows out of the tradition of Yiddish theater. I mean, the author of the play, Ansky, whose real name was Solomon Rappaport, had a background in ethnology, and it kind of, when it was kind of shaped into a drama, Stanislavski, you know, the director, and gave some kind of advice regarding the kind of dramaturgy, and he kind of suggested a figure like somebody in a Greek tragedy who's kind of like you know, the chorus basically kind of commenting on the action but being separate from the actual actors, and you know, and I think the messenger kind of serves as that function, and it's essential for this story to kind of give it context, and he's there to kind of, you know, explain but not actually interact.
So at the heart of the film is this promise that Nissan and Sender make to one another, even though they're technically not supposed to make this promise, which I found to be very interesting. They promise one another that if one person has a boy and the other one has a girl, that their children will end up getting married. And unfortunately, Nissan dies in this tragic storm, and then Sender eventually forgets that he made this promise. And Sender has a daughter, Nissan had a son, and we see them later on in life, we see Sender, and I love the way that we get this whole idea of Sender and his daughter, Leah, getting older, where we have Sender at this table, and he's there counting money, and his daughter will come in, or his daughter originally is in his wife's arms, and it's like, don't disturb me, I'm counting money. And then they kind of do a fade and then come back, and then here's the younger version of Leah, and he's like, leave me alone, I'm counting money. And it kind of it was kind of bad, because I'm just like, wow, what a Jewish stereotype, you know. It's like, leave me alone, I'm counting money. So, and then we get the older Leah that comes in, and again, Sender's there still counting money, but it was a nice way. It kind of reminded me of like the breakfast table scene in Citizen Kane, where they're going back and forth and seeing these people grow older and more, you know, in that one, hating each other more each year kind of thing. But in this one, we get to see Leah kind of grow up, and the way that she isn't necessarily the center of her father's world.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I made a note about that scene, just because I thought him saying, like, be quiet, father is counting money, is it did seem sort of on the nose. And I was wondering about that aspect of, if that's just my modern mind hearing that and thinking this seems like it's hewing close to a stereotype, because within the story, Sender's clearly not the only representative of the Jewish faith, you know? So within the story, he's very much the rich guy who thinks money can buy him everything and matters more than everything. But it didn't seem to me like that was a comment about Judaism. I don't know, but I don't know what the time, if that was seen, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if that was seen as just a representation of a character, or if it would have been taken as you know, validating a horrible stereotype, because it is very on the nose.
The basis of the film is a sin, and the sin is that these two guys make an agreement, and one of those guys breaks the agreement. And the reason he breaks the agreement is over money, the fact that he finds a groom with more money, a potential groom, that is. So he kind of forgets that agreement, or ignores it, or breaks it, and it's that transgression which sets the whole Dybbuk kind of story in motion.
Yeah, and there are other characters out there who are telling him, you know, you're always counting money, what's the matter with you? So I was like, okay, this wasn't just a Jewish stereotype. And I had the whole town just been there counting money all the time, I would have been like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But yeah, that is definitely a foible of his.
It's a Jewish play with Jewish director, kind of Jewish dramaturg. So I think it would be rather. I don't think that's the case at all. In many ways, it is a plot point. It's about a transgression, a kind of a breaking of an agreement, and that's why the spirit cannot rest, because he was destined to marry this girl, and because he couldn't, the spirit is a wandering one, and so, you know, it's really about a transgression.
Well, I think Sender transgresses quite a bit in this, because even when he first meets Canaan, who is Nisan's son, I want to say that he's breaking the Sabbath by having a carriage ride. The messenger and Canaan kind of show up in the story right around the same time, and I want to say that the messenger kind of chides Sender for doing that. I could be wrong, though, because that's the thing about this film, is that not just that I have a poor memory of it, because I did just watch it again last night, but just that there are times where I think I'm seeing stuff, or like the subtitles are there and then sometimes they're not. So it's just like, ay. So it was a little difficult of a watch, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on. But eventually Canaan comes into the story, and Canaan is Nisan's son, as we said, but there is no recognition of him being that. It isn't until about, I think, almost an hour into the proceedings that there is that final acknowledgement by Sender that this is his friend's son, and then he realizes and remembers the promise and everything. But yeah, to your point, Daniel, that's when he kind of ignores it, because there is potential for a better groom to come into the picture, because Canaan isn't necessarily the richest guy in the world. He is basically a student. He's just a yeshiva student who doesn't have a cent to his name. Like when he comes to town, and Leah meets him, and they strike up a friendship right away, and Leah asks him where he's going to spend the night. He's like, well, I'm going to spend the night in the synagogue. And of course, that's also where we get some of this spiritualism as well, because she's like, well, that's where the ghosts of other people will pray at that time. And he's like, oh, don't worry about it. I'm okay. But yeah, he's not. He doesn't have a B&B to stay at or a big hotel or anything. He's just a very, very plain student.
I thought that was interesting, the way the reveal of Cinder's recognition of the promise that he forgot played, because they tease it earlier when he's asleep at the table, and it's like there's a connection that could have been made in that scene right there, because the Kanan and Leah's meet cute is both of them saying, hey, my parent died on the day I was born, and then they have this sort of instant connection. And you see that if Cinder wasn't asleep in that moment, he would recognize the name Nisan, he would recognize the story, and so it made me wonder if we were going to go the whole movie without him recognizing it, and if that was going to be the kind of dramatic irony at play. But then the fact that he does recognize it, and it's what you were saying, you'd see the moment where he does, in fact, get the information in time to do something about it, and then he chooses not to. So I thought that was... I don't know, it's just a sophisticated sort of trajectory. Like the promise that was made and broken is a promise they really shouldn't have made in the first place. And then beyond that, when he does find out the truth, he still has time to act. I think that's kind of a key point in any tragic story, is that it could have gone another way.
Well, I think that, the tradition of kind of Yiddish theatre, it combines kind of melodrama with an element of social instruction. And there is a strong moral to this story, that keep your promises.
Yeah, even if you shouldn't have made them.
I think it's interesting, this kind of materialistic aspect to the fact. As you've already said, that the student is on the one hand very poor, but he's kind of he's a good student, and he goes beyond the call of duty. The way that he's familiar and dabbles with the Kabbalah. In fact, that's the source of being able to do this trick, so that his soul doesn't actually. It kind of lingers around the graveyard and ultimately takes possession of Leia. So, I think that the way the play came about is of ethnographic expeditions of kind of Ansky going to all these shtetls and collecting stories, parables, and fables, and then kind of fashioning it into a play at this time. And I think that it is. It's interesting now looking back at movies which refer to movies, and here's a movie referring to plays and to folk stories.
Yeah, you mentioned the German expressionism in this, and I noticed it throughout a few times, especially the storm scene, but really it wasn't until we get the scene of Leah and Kanan out in the street where there's a headstone in the middle of the street, and they start to talk about that, and then looking around at the set that they're in and seeing all of the pillars to the buildings that are kind of slanted, and it just is this kind of almost Caligari-esque world that they're inside of, and that really helped put me on edge and really kind of showed me that we're in this nightmare type world where anything can happen, and I found that to be very effective.
Yeah, it helped the magical aspect of the story. You're right. I love looking at those old sets and seeing just what they had to build and where it becomes a painting. And yeah, the technique behind the film was really very engrossing in that sense. And I keep using the word atmosphere, but I think that's the main thing. This movie was you take a step down into this atmosphere, and then you just it sweeps over you.
I completely agree with John about that. I think it's the strongest asset of the film. It is that feeling of being plunged into a world. It is just, and I think the pacing of the film actually contributes to that. The way that it kind of lulls you into this kind of very kind of melancholic, slightly mysterious kind of frame of mind. I'm actually in Warsaw at the moment, and I'm the district's Powiśle, and this is actually a few hundred meters away is where they actually shot most of the film in this Falanga film studio. Most of it was in the studio. There's only a few kind of exterior shots, and that's in a town called Kazimierz Dolny. But that kind of, particularly the kind of the exteriors and then the graveyards, it's just absolutely stunning, and I think it's on par with German expressionism. And I think Waszynski, the director, he even worked as an assistant at some point to Murnau, so there is even actually a concrete kind of aesthetic connection there.
So eventually we do have this whole conflict of Kanan could be the bridegroom, but eventually Sender announces that it's going to be somebody else, though Kanan is trying to work it with the Kabbalah so that he is the bridegroom. He wants to marry Leah, and there is this connection between Leah and him that, of course, does have this kind of supernatural wash to it because they were supposed to be together. Their fate was to be together. Their fathers made this promise, and now the father, Sender, is breaking it, but it feels like as soon as they see each other, they just click, and they know that they're supposed to be together. And so him, poor Sender, they're choosing somebody who has more income, breaking the promise and really breaking the fate, trying to keep this couple that is fated to be together apart. And so Kanan isn't necessarily going to put up with that, so he goes and uses more his Kabbalah to try to set things in his mind right, to the point where he is invoking the name of Satan to try to, become Leah's bridegroom. And that scene where he, is invoking Satan's name, and you've got the wind that's blowing and the shutters that are slamming and everything, and very, very powerful. And, I talk about the subtitles in the film, and the subtitles are very interesting to me because they take on different fonts depending on where we're at in the story. Sometimes they have this kind of stereotypical, like, Hebraic flourishes to them, especially when we're talking about the old times, these kind of things. And then sometimes we just have regular, serif font that's being used for conversation. And then every once in a while we'll dip into a sans serif font for moments like this, very powerful moments. And then later on, when Leah is possessed, that's when we get sans serif for her and serif for everybody else. It's like the voice from the other world uses this different font for his voice. And this was one of those moments where, him invoking Satan, I believe they're using all caps and sans serif font. And it made it even more powerful of a moment for me.
Yeah, well, we've all known probably for a long time that sans serif fonts are the devil's fonts, right? So this movie just confirms it.
Well, yeah, I believe that the man who created Verdana was actually a well-known Satanist.
That explains it. The fact that you caught that, because I wrote that down kind of halfway because it amused me, but also I went back and watched it again and noticed, I first noticed the font difference in the scene later where Leia shows up and she's speaking sort of with the Dybbuk's voice, and I noticed the font change, and I wrote that down. And then when I was watching it again, and I think you just referred to it, when Kanan is having his big moment where he says, like, I win again, I have conquered, or something, it's like all caps, and it's the same sans serif font. And so I was thinking, okay, yeah, so they really were doing something kind of, again, something more sophisticated than you might think was going on the surface, with like the sans serif font being an indicator that this is sort of a voice from beyond.
The font choices really were making a difference, whether we noticed it at first or not. But yet there are so few things that are being subtitled for us. So many times where we're getting a conversation where two people are talking and maybe every third thing that they say is being translated. It was just like, this is so frustrating. But it was such a compelling story that I stuck with it. So I guess that's kind of a testament to the filmmaking prowess.
And also the actors and the way that the two different voices she uses, lili-liliana, who plays Leia, to kind of denote the kind of the possessed version of herself and the non-possessed version of herself. I mean, I think that kind of acting as well. I mean, it is very melodramatic. It is very expressionistic, but it isn't to the point when it's distracting and you're recognizing it as a style. It's just full-bodied acting, and I enjoy it.
Well, yeah, to see the difference between her when we first see her and she's very carefree, comparing that to when she is possessed by the Dybbuk, it's just like, wow, this is quite a performance for her. I mean, just some of the reactions that she gives when she is on trial or when the Dybbuk is on trial later on, it's just like, wow, she's really doing a great job with this. And there are some great performances. And I have to say that the guy who plays the main rabbi does a really good job. I mean, he plays this whole like world weary, he doesn't feel like he is up to the task at first, and he kind of has to like almost charge himself up by saying, my grandfather did this, and my great-great-grandfather did that, and he lists off all of these amazing feats that his lineage has done, and then he finally is just like, I am up for this now. But he plays it really, really well, the way that he, carries that weight to him.
And also the mother. I think she's fantastic as well.
He's talking about the woman, the older woman that kind of stands in for the mother with preparing the bride for the wedding and everything.
Towards the end, when she's wailing incredibly. Yeah.
But isn't she the same character? Like, she's the one who, when they went out and looked at the bride and groom, the holy grave in the town, and Leia throws herself on it, saying that she wants them to protect her from this wedding she doesn't want to, this marriage that she doesn't want to be part of. The mother allows her to pray for Canaan's soul to come to the wedding and then she says it'll be my sin. And then later, when she's, as the scene that Daniel's speaking of, I believe, where she's kind of looking out the window and she's just, raving, She says, it's my sin, it's my sin. And so it is interesting that even that character has sort of a culpability and she says it will be her sin. And then later she feels horrified because she realizes perhaps that she did sort of set the stage for Leia to kind of let that spirit in.
Right, it's interesting. I mean, those two sets of kind of, there's two headstones, because at the beginning, I mean, the one in the square, I mean, this is they explain it. It's to do with the Chmielnicki massacres in the 17th century, which were about a bride and groom which didn't complete their kind of marriage vows before they were kind of murdered by pogromists. And of course, so you've got this in the background of the story. Then it happens again. And then you've got like another irony, which we've not touched upon yet, is that, of course, the film was made in 1937. So, of course, this whole world vanishes within the space of 5-6 years.
I found that thought so oppressive, actually, while watching the film. I've wondered about all the actors and everyone involved, like just how their world changed in 2 years, within 2 years.
Well, I think Lili-Liliana, I think she certainly ended up in New York, and she was still... I think I read somewhere that she was still acting in kind of Yiddish theater in New York. So, I mean, it's and Waszynski's career obviously changed. I mean, he worked in Europe on the fringes of Hollywood. But yeah, I mean, it is terrifying to kind of look at that film. And I think that's what's interesting about visiting Warsaw today, how it's kind of like it's conspicuous by its absence, this whole world. I mean, certainly the Muranov, traditionally the kind of the what was the Jewish part of the city is it's just gone, and there's hardly any trace even of the ghetto, just a few fragments of wall and the odd building. So it really is very bizarre looking not just at this film but also photos from that period. It's there, but it's not. We're like a ghost.
Talking about where these actors ended up, because the guy that played Canon and the woman that played Leah actually ended up getting married years later. And to your point, Daniel, they moved to the U.S. and they both lived pretty long lives. I want to say that Leon Liebgold, the guy that played Canon, was in his 80s when he passed away. So they did okay, even though, their entire world was just torn down shortly after this movie was made.
I think there's an interesting aspect. I mean, you see this in the photographs of Roman Vishniak. I think this idea that this feeling that we must record this for posterity, and I think that was certainly one of Ansky's motives, of collecting evidence and of shtetl life and existence. I mean, obviously at the time, he didn't know what was going to be around the corner, so, in several decades. But it is. I mean, one of the strange things now is in Muranov, the district I mentioned, a few years ago, they opened up a museum of the history of the Polish Jews, and it's fantastic. But it's also faced with this huge dilemma in the whole concept of the place: is what do you put inside? And I think this is the terrifying thing about Warsaw is that, how do you cannot obviously forget this, but how do you remember it? And I think that's, in a strange way, it's kind of addressed obliquely in this film in an abstract way, which certainly for me makes it, it gives it resonance today.
So the thing we've been kind of pussyfooting around with when it comes to the film is the actual possession, where the actual Dybbuk of the title comes into play. And it's from the death of Kanan and then him, as you were saying, being invited into the wedding. And I love the scene at the kind of ceremony. I don't think it is the wedding itself. It's the ceremony before, when Leah is dancing with this person who's got this skull mask on, and the way that we have that superimposition of Kanan's face over the skull. Man, that was terrific. I really like that.
It's so simple, so effective.
It reminds me in a strange way. I mean, the immediate thought was the Red Shoes Ballet when it starts to get really weird halfway through, and it's that's what it actually reminded me of. And of course, you could say that the roots of both those, Powell and Pressburger and this film is in some ways inspired by German Expressionism, but it really is the kind of the most musical aspect of the film, with an awful lot of music, singing and dancing.
Yeah, there's some good song breaks right around this time.
Well, yeah, you've got the dance of the poor, the dance of the beggars, the dance. I think there's the dance of the rich. There's the tap dance. It was very. I couldn't decide if it was. Again, not knowing much about the traditions myself, I was wondering, is this sort of an accurate depiction of the traditional marriage ceremony, or was this the movie kind of making a point and just in a sort of simplistic way saying, here's what's going on inside, here's what's going on outside? Because there was clearly another scene later that compared the inside and outside of the wedding by virtue of how much bread you were given. The guests of the wedding got a whole loaf of bread, and these are presumably wealthy people. And then the poor people out on the streets all got a little scrap of bread, who probably could have used the bread a bit more. I think that's another comment on Sender, but I also didn't know if that was a sort of a tradition that I'm not aware of.
The modern Hasidic movement was founded in Poland in the 18th century, by this Baal Shem Tov. Someone who called for a spiritual renaissance. It's something to be made up through all this singing, dancing, and ecstasy. It's this, and I think that's what really it's an ecstatic film, and I think that's most of the film. The subtitles are kind of like stabilizers on a bike, just keeping it upright. But the actual motor, it is actually all of these things which are extremely theatrical and wonderfully cinematic. It is a musical. It's a horror musical with a kind of a Romeo and Juliet kind of counterpoint to it. It is schmaltzy in some respects. it's not oppressively so, but it is very much pulling on heartstrings in terms of the acting and the themes and the love and this kind of, we're due to be together forever and everything else. Ironically, looking at it now from my point of view, it's the antithesis of everything which comes to mind when I think of Polish cinema. It's, this kind of sumptuous, playful dancing, and fun. It is a fun film in a strange way. I think it is a fun film.
Well, it does have little moments of light comedy throughout too, like, what's his name? Menashe of Klimovka, or Menashe of Klimovka, I believe, the intended bridegroom for Leia, that is, the wealthy man's son. His fear of marriage and fear of speaking in front of people is clearly played, I thought, for laughs. We're supposed to see him as kind of a ridiculous man to be married to, but it's also a little comic scene where you return to him and whoever it is that's kind of teaching him and getting him ready for the marriage. And then I thought even in the opening narration, I believe he's referred to as a wonder rabbi, but it's the kind of lead rabbi of the piece. His little moments are laced with a little bit of comic aspects too. You mentioned, I think, I forget which of you mentioned that he kind of needs to be sort of talked up. He's kind of despairing, and then he kind of peps himself up with a little bit of prompting. And I thought that was both an interesting characteristic, but also a kind of a funny guy, a guy who's going to sit there and kind of wilt in the chair, and he's being a little melodramatic even within this world. That character of the rabbi seemed like it was slightly comic to me.
There are nice moments to this, and when I think of Polish cinema, Daniel, I think of Man of Iron, and that kind of era of Polish cinema, and this is definitely very different from that.
Well, I think one of the things which made me go back to this film in particular was, as you know, a few years ago, there was this touring season internationally of Martin Scorsese Presents Classics of Polish Cinema. And on many ways, it is great because the films in the program are wonderful. But of course, it gives the impression that Polish cinema began with communism and nothing existed before, and it ended with the fall of communism. Now, the reason is that those films were kind of all owned by former kind of communist film studios, which are now kind of managed on behalf of the state by kind of semi-private companies, and so the kind of the pool of films was limited to this period. But I think the history of Polish cinema goes beyond that, and it does miss out this crucial chapter of kind of Yiddish cinema in the 30s, and also this avant-garde tradition. I mean, one of the guys who acts as a kind of I think he's credited as a consultant, like a dramaturg, is Anatol Stern, who's a Jewish Polish futurist poet who ended up during the 30s writing mainly scripts. So you have this incredibly kind of rich Jewish avant-garde and non-communist elements, which kind of result in this cinema, which is the antithesis to what came in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I mean, there were musicals. I mean, there was a communist musical called Adventure in Marienstadt, which is actually pretty good. It was the first Polish color film, I think. Nothing like this, and I think it's interesting that all of the characters in Polish culture, certainly recent Polish culture, which touch upon the fantastic, whether it's Stanisław Lem or Piotr Szolkin, most of them are of Jewish descent, and I think this it's like Kafka. It's kind of these fantastic tales of fables and parables. This is where it comes from. I think this is the cultural background, which is it's not specifically Polish. It's Polish Jewish.
So we've got the possession. We have the Dybbuk, which is kind of I don't know, would you guys consider it the fusing of the two spirits, or is it more of kind of taking over Leah? Because it seems like it should be the fusing of the two, but it feels like when we have him speaking through her, that is definitely more his voice than her voice.
Well, it's got that bit at the beginning, and I think in the credits when it's talking about transmigration of the souls, as it does in the beginning of the play. So it sets up the idea that after the spell, the spirit goes presumably into the ether and then kind of falls or plunges into Leia. But how do we address this? I mean, is it like ghosts? I mean, are ghosts just like a kind of a manifestation of guilt? Even if it's not your own guilt, it's guilt. It's the guilt of your father. So I mean, that's the expression of whether it's a subconscious, whether it's something else. But I think that's how I look at that aspect of it.
Yeah, I was reading an article about Dybbuks and just the stories, and because there have been people who have gone out and have written down these stories of different possessions throughout the years, just looking at all of the typical things that are happening, and it does feel like it's more of a way to rebel against society, and especially against a very strict society. I mean, there are so many rules when it comes to life, Judaism existence. I'm surprised that it doesn't happen more, because there are just so many of these rules, and then you have a younger person like Leah who really is being shafted by the system, by her father, and kind of rebelling out of that. So it's always fascinating to me to look at these possession stories as being multi-layered, as could it be supernatural, or could it be a rebellion? Could it be just psychological? So it was this is yet another instance where I'm like, okay, what is really happening here, or how can we interpret this possession of hers?
Well, I see it as it's a form of dissociation. It's like like Asmodeus, sort of like, okay, you're a nun, like in the Huxley book, and the sister Jeanne, which Ken Russell made his film based on the play based on Huxley's book. The idea that you're a nun and you have certain principles, or you have to live by them. At the same time, you have these sexual urges, and you can't reconcile these two things. So what do? You split them, you dissociate them, and you say, okay, it's not me. It's the devil which is kind of possessing me. And that way you get to kind of carry out or enact whatever impulses are taking over you. At the same time, you're not responsible for them. I guess the modern analog today is Tiger Woods says, I'm a sex addict, as if to say that basically I'm not responsible. This is a medical condition. Therefore, we should put the blame on, I don't know, God, for making animals like this. It's a shifting of the blame, it's like Shame, the Steve McQueen film. The idea that there's a lot of debate right now, isn't it, about sex addiction, whether it's a real thing or not. And I think it's a similar thing in this case. The idea that it's a way of reconciling Leia's kind of her feelings and her father's feelings, and of course she can't reconcile them. Her father wants her to marry someone else. So how does she kind of psychologically get out of this pickle? And and you can look at that in rational terms as I'm painting it, or you can look at it in fantastic terms. The point is that you're arriving at the same point.
Well, I was just thinking about how that scene played out as such a, particularly like the trial, the rabbinical court, the midnight. I think it said that we'll have a rabbinical court at midnight to do this, which just sounds very ominous. And yes, you've got all these old bearded men in this room, and then you're bringing in this young woman who is the sort of, she's the innocent, but she's also the transgressor, in that one scene. And it did sort of seem to me like, I don't know, I think I was still trying to figure out how I was supposed to read the character of the rabbi, because he seems to be sort of full of it in that scene, even as much as he may be channeling something legitimate. But what he seems to be doing is trying to restore the status quo of this rich man marrying off his daughter to a rich man's family, And that seems like all these elders are very interested in that. And I thought it was interesting the way the messenger shows up to sort of throw a wrench in that, to say that no, he basically comes out and says that we didn't hear the Spirit say Amen, and so therefore they didn't accept the deal. I thought that was an interesting kind of refutation of even the character of the rabbi, who, as we've said, does kind of seem to be a force for good in the story, or at least a guy who's trying to follow some form of the rules. But even he is, subject to this idea of what the townspeople might want and what the elders want and what this very rich man might want.
Right. He seems to be very concerned about getting the Spirit out of her and getting her married off. The setting things right as far as in his mind of getting Leah married to this other man is one of the most important driving factors for him. And it just is like, let's hurry up and do this. Let's get this thing going. And I love this whole idea of putting her on trial, or putting the Spirit on trial. And of course, I'm reminded of like the Salem witch trials and some of that, dissociation that Daniel was talking about. But this, just this whole idea of following the rules and having these meetings, and there are very specific things that need to be said, and all this kind of ritual that goes along with that. And, looking at a film like the Dybbuk versus something like The Exorcist, where, there's no trial happening, but they're so formal in the Dybbuk as far as needing to put this person on trial and basically, okay, now the spirit has to leave the body. Like that's their way of getting rid of it. There's no holy water and all this kind of stuff. Yes, there's chanting and everything, and just her reaction to stuff, Leah's reaction, obviously she's not spinning her head around and spitting out green pea soup or anything. So it's just, I love the comparison of the very sociable Dybbuk versus, the spirit that possessed Reagan.
Well, it's an aggrieved spirit. It's not inherently evil as the spirit. It's just basically a wronged spirit, and what they're trying to do in that final scene is to kind of right a wrong. And then why is this spirit pissed off? Why is it in this woman? And let's weigh up whether it has a right to be pissed off or not. And they conclude it does, and then they kind of work out an agreement. And of course, then the natural agreement at the end is it's like Romeo and Juliet. I mean, she's reunited with her lover to be, the destined love, but of course that means death.
So often in these films, we have a spirit. I mean, if it's a possession film or a ghost movie or whatever, because the Dybbuk is like on the line between like a possessing demon and a ghost. It's kind of a very personal ghost that attaches to somebody. Doesn't the word itself mean cling or clinging? So it's this idea of a spirit attaching to somebody. And so often in the way this is treated in horror films, it's like there's a spirit and then you get a little bit of backstory on the spirit as the story goes along. But in this movie, we spend an hour developing the character of the young man whose spirit comes back as a sort of semi-malevolent force, you know? So I think that also served to humanize him, is that at the end when they're exorcising the Dybbuk from Leah, we're not just thinking of her as a woman that's being exorcised, we're thinking of Canaan's soul as being sort of disconnected from anything and, you know, wandering the earth and being tormented. And there is that little nod to, well, now that the spirit's out of her, we'll get to you. You know, it seems very much like first priority is getting him out of the girl, and then after that, it's about trying to give this spirit some rest. Which I can't tell at the end if we're supposed to think that anything that the rabbi did really worked that well, because of what happens with Leah. But I do think that notion of showing compassion for the spirit seems to be a huge thing that makes this distinct in my mind from the usual treatment of this subject matter.
Well, you're going to hate this, but I mean, what about as a comparison, Ghost, the Demi Moore movie? Because basically it's a love story with a fantastic element. The ending is very different, but the interesting ending about Dybbuk is how it's sad for the kind of the physical world, but for the spiritual world, it's a happy ending because the lovers are reunited. It is a dramatically satisfying ending because at the beginning the lovers are separated, and at the end the lovers are reunited.
All it needed was a potter's wheel scene.
It's funny that you bring up Ghost, because I actually was thinking of another Demi Moore movie when I was watching this. I was thinking of The Seventh Sign for some reason, and I guess the whole idea of because there was another Dybbuk movie a few years ago, I want to say it was The Unborn, and just that whole idea of like when the soul enters into a baby, and does a baby have a soul, and this whole thing, and just that in The Seventh Sign, this whole idea of like there aren't enough souls to go around until this woman makes this sacrifice. So I guess Demi Moore was destined to be brought into this conversation in some way.
I think that the difference between this film is that really the kind of the Dybbuk it's the MacGuffin, and whereas I think a lot of the more recent horror films, they kind of focus and are preoccupied totally with the MacGuffin at the expense of everything else, and it's just basically it's a device to talk about a particular culture, and a love story in a particular culture, and that's what it is. That's its role and its function. Whereas I think in the more overtly horror films, it's just basically it's a pretext for setting up shock scenes, and this is two different kind of intentions, and they're both legitimate, but they're just two different kind of uses of that kind of possession. God, I'm hating myself here. Motive.
Had this been directed, like a Blumhouse film, we would have had the big jump scare at the end of Leah's face all, painted up, like coming right at the camera. But fortunately, we didn't have that.
Well, I was thinking about that when I watched this film, and I just thought about what a feat of acting it was. That scene at the end where she basically stands up, and it's like a long kind of tracking shot of her, or a dolly shot, I guess, where it kind of moves with her as she gets up off the steps and steps up to the altar, and it's just one sustained shot, and the way it holds on the acting and it allows you to just soak in the mood of the scene is so much more effective and so much more magical than all the like jump cuts and crazy CGI assisted morphing faces and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I still enjoy modern horror films, but it's true that they fall back on a lot of the same tricks to create scares that I'm not even sure actually work, and then you just see the human face on screen for a couple minutes go through something that an actor is projecting, and it can be extremely powerful. So I thought that last moment with Leia was one of the best parts of the movie.
I think one of the things I like most about it is this kind of trance-like atmosphere which comes about of the technique, which is on the one hand, it's seemingly very simple, but at the same time, it's really sophisticated. I mean, the way that none of the shots kind of draw attention to themselves as expressionistic. I mean, they're all from conventional angles, and the lenses are, they're not too distorting, but the way in which basically it's just kind of dolling in for a close-up and then pulling back out, or then just tracking slightly, it builds up this it is a very like kind of trancey kind of atmosphere in this film.
There are moments of camera work in here that I really enjoyed, especially when they're having one of the trial scenes and we're on all of the old men, the rabbi, and they're just, all in agreement about this stuff. And then the camera just pans over and looks at Leah and then comes back over to these guys. And it's just like so simple, but so effective. Just that they are all talking about her, but she is so out of the picture. Just let's take a look at her now. Now let's go back to what this is. And just I love the way that the camera was leading us through so many of these moments.
No, I agree completely. My knowledge of cinema at that period, it is patchy, but it does, for me at least, it does strike me as a very sophisticated film. And I think it really... I think it's an incentive to look more not just at Waszynski's kind of films, but also that whole period as a whole. I mean, it's been written about. I mean, Hoberman's written the book on Yiddish cinema, but I think certainly in Poland, the Filmoteka Narodowa, the National Film Archive, they made some new copies of Waszynski's films a few years ago. The last time I saw Dybbuk at the cinema was the copy, a scan of the Polish into negative. I mean, they have one element in Warsaw, and then I think the negative is in New York somewhere. But I really hope this film actually comes out in a kind of a decent restored copy with adequate subtitles.
Well, let's definitely talk a little bit more about that after we take a quick break here, and we're going to play an interview with Yossi-Chajes. I'm probably butchering his name. Chajes, author of Between Worlds, Dybbuk's Exorcist and Early Modern Judaism, and we'll play that just after these brief messages.
Let me ask you a question. Are you getting enough? I bet you'd love more, right? Well, AdamandEve.com wants to give you more with 10 free gifts. First, you'll get a sexy surprise for her. Second, a specially selected toy for him. And third, a little something we know you'll both enjoy. Plus, you'll get 6 full-length adult movies on DVD. And number 10, free shipping on your entire order. So what do you have to do to get your 10 free gifts? It's not hard. Just go to AdamandEve.com and select any one item. It could be an adventurous new toy, sexy piece of lingerie, or anything you desire. Just enter offer code BOOTH at checkout, and you'll get all 10 free gifts. Go check out AdamandEve.com today. Select one item and get 10 free gifts, including free shipping when you enter offer code BOOTH. That's BOOTH at AdamandEve.com.
Hello from Cinema Detroit. We are Metro Detroit's only truly independent cinema and also the only first-run 7-day-a-week movie theater in Greater Downtown. We deliver an eclectic mix of current, indie, genre, cult, and classic movies in the heart of the city. Like a sommelier choosing wine for his or her guests, we handpick our slate of films, many of which are exclusive to the Metro Detroit area, the state of Michigan, or occasionally the entire Midwest region. Cinema Detroit features in a unique setting in a former furniture store and a warm hometown atmosphere, including always fresh popcorn, Detroit-made Faygo soda, and other locally created treats. Please visit our website, cinemadetroit.com, for the latest features and showtimes. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. We look forward to seeing you soon at 4126 3rd Street in the city, zip code 48201.
Movies need only three things: badasses.
You tell me who you want done, and I'll do the hell out of it.
A chick with drive who don't take no jive.
Boobs.
Do you know that the female breast, known to be the source of life since Eve, can be deadly weapons?
And body counts.
Body count. The mathematics of murder and menace.
The BB and BC podcast is your source for exploitation film discussion of B-movies. You can find the show on iTunes and Stitcher Radio by searching for BB and BC podcast. You can also listen to each episode directly from the show's website located at badassesboobsandbodycounts.com.
Let's go to work.
This is Adam Spiegelman, the host of my second favorite movie podcast called Proudly Resent at proudlyresents.com. And you are listening to my favorite, the number one, The Projection Booth. Mike put so much work into it. If you listen to my show, I put no work into it. Enjoy the rest of the show, you lucky son of a gun.
My name is Yossi-Chajes. Well, I should say that's one of my names because you can't probably spell the name just from hearing it. So I should tell you it's spelled C-H-A-J-E-S. The only place I can say the name and have somebody spell it correctly is Germany. Because, in fact, that's where they first wrote it out, and they know how it's supposed to look and sound. My American passport still says Jeffrey on it, and my synagogue circumcision certificate says Joseph on it, and everyone here calls me Yossi for the last 30 years. So, anyway, it's kind of a mess. I should never have gone into it. My publications sometimes figure, you'll find them under Jeffrey Chajes, Yossi-Chajes, Joseph Chajes. I work for a few people, apparently. So I have a lot of names, and I teach in the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa in Israel.
You are a fellow Wolverine. How did you decide to go into Jewish history as your major?
While a student in Ann Arbor, as an undergraduate, I moved pretty quickly from my original thoughts, which were somewhat politically oriented. I thought maybe I would pursue a career in politics. And I had other interests as well, music and theater. Anyway, I moved quickly in my freshman year to an interest in mysticism of various sorts. And I began studying whatever was offered in the different departments. Great books of China class, which exposed me to Taoism, to Dick Mann's legendary transpersonal psychology courses. Again, it all happened pretty quickly in my freshman year. I thought it would be particularly appropriate given my family history, which includes many generations of rabbis, to explore the mysticism of the Jewish people. And I began studying Kabbalah and thought that I would be a fairly straightforward scholar of Kabbalah until, for various reasons, crazy reasons, I ended up staying in Ann Arbor to do my master's degree. The best thing I could figure out to do at the time was to do that master's degree in European history. I thought it would set me up well for subsequent studies of Kabbalah and Jewish culture, but I thought, well, I'll get some good basic professional training as a European historian. I did complete that degree and then eventually pursued my PhD in Jewish history at Yale, mostly because at the time there was nobody in Ann Arbor who could really supervise the kind of PhD I was interested in writing. But from the time I got my MA in history at Michigan, I was dedicated to pursuing a study of Jewish thought and Kabbalah that would be a kind of integration of history and the study of a mystical thought, some kind of middle path. So I still see myself as, professionally speaking, basically an historian. But I also teach a lot of classes on the history of Judaism as part of my work, and my own writing still has a lot to do with magic and Kabbalah. One thing is sure, and that is I didn't become an economic historian or a political historian. something of that sort.
I'm familiar with the Torah, I'm familiar with the Talmud, but where does Kabbalah fit into the realm of Judaism?
Kabbalah is kind of a general name for medieval Jewish mysticism. I don't even love using the term mysticism because it really isn't a term that is really at home in the Jewish tradition. We don't have a word that corresponds to it in Hebrew, for example, but we do have something going back at least 2,000 years or more that you could probably translate into English as esotericism, or the idea that the tradition also contains a secret dimension and that there are secrets that are shared, passed from generation to generation by people who have received them to people who are worthy of receiving them. And one of the interesting, strange, quirky things about the history of Judaism is that although the Torah is called the written Torah, or the written tradition, you might say, because it originated as a text that was committed to writing. The rest of the Jewish tradition is called the oral tradition, even though for hundreds and even well over 1,000 years, most of that oral material has also been committed to writing. That's to some extent an unfortunate outcome of persecutions that led Jews in various periods to believe that if they didn't commit something to writing and the wrong person was killed, that the tradition would die. So what I'm trying to get to is to say that the Kabbalah is one form of Jewish esotericism, or secrets of Judaism. It's a body of secret knowledge that has, to some extent, been committed to writing, but still undoubtedly has much unwritten that is, till our own day, passed within closed circles of Kabbalists, or Jewish mystics, if you like. And I guess I should say one more thing, and that is just that from probably about the late 13th century, although this is strictly speaking esoteric material, there's a kind of constant popularization or tendency to further popularize and distribute this lore among ever broader circles of people. You might think that I should have said among ever wider circles of Jews, and that is largely true, that it's a Jewish secret lore, but from the 13th century already, we have a lot of evidence for Christian interest in Kabbalah, and by the 14th, 15th centuries, we have something called Christian Kabbalah, which develops for hundreds of years and has, to some extent, a kind of life of its own. This, we think of the interest in Kabbalah by Madonna today as some crazy expression of how Kabbalah has become marketed to a general audience. And it's true that, you can't compare 20th or 21st century marketing to 16th century marketing. But in fact, as soon as the Zohar, the greatest work of the Kabbalah, was printed in the 16th century, it reached a lot of places. A lot of people read it, and a lot of people got interested in it. These are fairly perennial aspects of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism.
So what are some of the things that would be contained in the Jewish mysticism? Like, I'm trying to think of like a Christian, something similar so that I can kind of ground myself as far as one to the other.
I mean, Christian mysticism, if you can take an extreme generalization, Christian mysticism is usually autobiographical accounting of mystical experience, some kind of expression of the grace of revelation coming over the mystic and the ineffable experience of that in the mystic's subjective experience. And Jewish mysticism has a more objectivist orientation, and that comes out in a few different ways. On the one hand, Jews are much more confident than Christians that they can create a situation that will result in a mystical experience, or result in mystical knowledge. Some of that you could perhaps attribute to a kind of more magical character in general that Kabbalah has as opposed to Christian mysticism for the most part. And if you look at things sort of magically, it becomes almost like a recipe. If you do this, that, and the other thing, then you can be fairly confident that you'll get the results you're looking for. So Kabbalists have that tendency to confidence that they know what is required to get the results they're looking for. Part of Kabbalah is also objectivist in its confident description of the divine realms, much more than I think is true in most of Christian Kabbalah, Christian mysticism in general. Jewish Kabbalah is quite confident about its mapping of the terrain of the Godhead. It's not something that Jews come back from experiencing and say, wow, it's beyond description, it's beyond words, we can't even talk about what we've seen and experienced. Jews who write Kabbalah have tended to write very objectively about the terrain of the divine that they either experienced or inferred or whatever. So there's that as well. And I guess another objective thing that ties into the preparation side of things is in, I would say, more magical expressions of Kabbalistic expertise. And you see that in some areas that are relatively well known in popular culture, like the golem idea, the idea that a rabbi could make a kind of animated humanoid or anthropoid creature, an artificial man, the artificial intelligence, that's been talked about in Jewish sources for 2,000 years, how you can take a mound of clay and shape it into the form of a human being and bring it to life. And we have quite a few recipes in the Jewish esoteric tradition for doing just that. There's a very interesting German silent film called The Golem, which makes an interesting counterpart as well to the 1937 Dybbuk film. But in fact, Dybbuk is the other great example of an area in which Kabbalists have brought their mystical powers to a practical problem, and that is how to exorcise an evil spirit from a person possessed. That's a job that has typically gone to the Kabbalists over the last 500 years, and even before that, going back 2,000 years. The presumption has been that people who have the power to successfully exorcise an evil spirit are precisely the rabbis who have some knowledge of the esoteric lore of the tradition.
Now, I'm sure you've seen William Friedkin's film or read William Peter Blady's book. How does a Dybbuk compare to more of a Christian type of possession?
The most profound difference is in the identity of the spirit. In the Christian cases, one generally finds people are diagnosed as possessed when a devil or even numerous devils are found to be inhabiting their bodies and have taken them over. And the exorcist's job is to get rid of those demons. We do have, by the way, historical evidence for Christians themselves identifying evil spirits as ghosts of souls familiar to them in the early modern period. But priests who are charged with conducting the exorcisms and dealing with these situations generally were determined to convince people that this was not only an incorrect diagnosis of the possession, but in fact a heretical one. And in the Jewish context, we find from about the 16th century, we find from the 16th century an increasing tendency to identify evil spirits possessing people as precisely that, as ghosts of members of the community who recently passed away in most cases. In other words, a Dybbuk is a person who has died and for whatever reason is not going through the typical afterlife passage to to a kind of purgatory and ultimately, hopefully, to heavenly abode, but is sort of stuck and seeking shelter or assistance by possessing the body of a living person, or just possessing a living person who then becomes the mouthpiece for that disembodied soul. One of the things that I found that was quite interesting in studying the exorcism techniques over the generations in the Jewish tradition was that with this new diagnosis in the 16th century came new exorcism techniques that were designed to deal with the difference between having to just get rid of a demon and having to deal with a Dybbuk, who is basically a second human victim of the story. Even if the Dybbuk is an aggressor, the Dybbuk is an aggressor for whom you might feel a certain amount of sympathy, given the fact that whatever they did in their life, and it might have been something horrible, every Dybbuk story will impress the reader with just how high a price has been paid for it, and the exorcist will feel like it's their responsibility to not only serve the victim of the possession, but to somehow try to alleviate the suffering of the Dybbuk as well in the process. That's a pretty big difference.
Why the 16th century? Why did this kind of become prevalent at that time? Do you know?
That kind of question will not have an answer written on a page of a 16th century book, and forces me to speculate. But if I had to, I would say that it is part and parcel of a much greater tendency in the 16th century to focus on the fate of the individual. The medieval and earlier religious materials have a much more communal orientation. You might call it more of a herd mentality. People are part of a group. Their fate is the fate of the group. And famously, Jakob Burckhardt, the historian of the Renaissance, spoke about the Renaissance as the period of history in which we saw in the West the birth of the individual. And of course, these are very big sort of generalizations to come out with, but it's hard to avoid feeling that in the 16th century, many aspects of Jewish culture, in particular, evince this new concern with the fate of the individual. And it finds expression in other areas as well. Not unrelated to the Dybbuk is the rise of importance in the doctrine of reincarnation among Jews in the 16th century. Again, one could ask the same question. Why do the Jews all of a sudden in the 16th century become so obsessed with reincarnation? You don't find reincarnation in any work of classical Judaism. You don't find it in the Bible. You don't find it in the Talmud. All of a sudden, in the 13th century, you find very cautious references to it in some Kabbalistic sources. But in the 16th century, everything is about your transmigratory journeys. And the great Kabbalist of the 16th century is someone who can look at you and know all of your incarnations and why you've been born as you have this time around and what you need to accomplish before you die. And you need to know that too, because if you don't know what you need to do before you die, you're going to have to be born again. So really the best I can do is you could say the Dybbuk is redefined in the 16th century as part of the centralization of the doctrine of reincarnation, because a Dybbuk is basically a kind of reincarnation that happens, but in a bad way, rather than the person who died being reincarnated as a baby and getting another chance. They're not actually getting properly reincarnated. They are getting reincarnated, though, quite literally, put back into a body, just not from square one. And they're doing so in a way that is usually detrimental to their host. But if I say that, then you can rightly ask me, well, why did reincarnation become more central in the 16th century? To which I would probably just go back to Burckhardt and this very general sense that in the early modern period, if you want to use a broader term than the Renaissance, in the early modern period, we see a new interest in in the fate and plight and possibility of the individual that's unprecedented. This is one of many expressions of that kind of individual orientation. That's a speculation, but it's not unconnected to other things that we know about the period.
Now, was this the same period that you were studying and writing about when you wrote Between Worlds?
Absolutely, yeah. My book, Between Worlds, focuses on the 16th century with some interest as well in how things will play out in the 17th century already in kind of a different environment. The 16th century is the era of the great formative accounts of Dybbuk possession and Jewish sources. And by the 17th century, we already have, especially into the second half of the 17th century, we already have the equivalent of what you might call like horror stories being published in the Jewish world that are not exactly, what you would get a couple hundred years later when they really are pure entertainment. But they're kind of a mixture of entertainment and moral literature, in the sense that if you read these things, you can be titillated, but you also might be afraid that if you're immoral, you could end up in one of these horrible ghost stories yourself. So they have that sort of double function. But yeah, I've always been really interested in the transition to modernity and Kabbalah and magic. And looking at the Dybbuk material was a great way of combining all of those things that I think are really interesting. The Dybbuk book that I wrote was the first thing that anyone had written on the subject in Jewish culture. I'm happy to say that on my desk right now is a book that is hot off the presses here in Israel. And it basically begins where my book left off. It deals with 17th and 18th century materials. The first footnote in this book, which is, looks like a 500-page book, 573 pages. The first footnote is to my book, and I'm glad now somebody picked up the ball and ran with it another couple hundred years. It's actually focusing on Yiddish materials from Eastern Europe. That actually gets us a bit closer to Ansky sources. In other words, the actual folkloristic materials that Ansky uses to construct his modern heretical myth are probably better seen now through this latest study than they are in my own. But I suppose also it probably should be noted, if the interview is supposed to be about the movie, that Ansky, in addition to everything else, he wasn't just a playwright. In fact, he wasn't even close to just being a playwright. He was an ethnographer and was trying to create a Jewish ethnographic museum. And during the First World War, he was going around with an ethnographic expedition to all kinds of little towns in Eastern Europe, collecting stories and artifacts of various kinds, and even recording old chants. I think they had some kind of like first generation wax recording device. Unfortunately, a lot of the material, I think the huge majority, was subsequently lost in the turbulent decades that ensued. But there's no doubt that Ansky himself, who was basically, a secular, a non-religious Jew from the big city, first began to became aware of Dybbuk stories that in the course of this ethnographic expedition, and so his raw materials were almost certainly gathered primarily from these travels to the little cities and stories that he was told and that his team recorded during those years. So that's the raw materials that he would weave together to tell the story that he wanted to tell, which was ultimately not just a cute representation of ethnographic material, but I think something more profound. Well, the raw materials were gathered as part of his great ethnographic expedition. It's a huge topic, really. I mean, there are entire books written on this play and its reception and the different productions and the sets and the costumes and the dramaturgy. It's a field. And Ansky's been the subject of a lot of writing in the last 10, 20 years. So there's a really tremendous amount of interest, and there really was never a hit on the Yiddish or Hebrew stage that compared to it.
The study of the Hebrew stage, the study of Yiddish language films, like so many things, this can lead to so many possible areas of study.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sure if you had spoken to someone who was an expert on Russian theater, they would have given you a very different sense of what Ansky was doing in that play. Although I think that ultimately the interpretations don't have to be one at the expense of the other. Like, there's a general tendency in early 20th century Russian theater to create these kind of almost like religious experiences on stage, and to have, the stage becomes a kind of a sacred altar. Maybe that's not the best word, but there is a kind of visceral religious dimension to what's happening in the space of the theater. And, so Ansky was able to exploit that, or not exploit it, but he was part of that. And I think that the theatrical elements of what he did are not indebted to Jewish mythology from 2,000 years ago. They're indebted to the theatrical conventions and fashions of his age. But the message that he wanted to express, and the materials that he was able to bring to bear to express that message perfectly suited the fashions of the Russian stage at that time. So much so that I'm no expert, but everybody's heard of Stanislavski, the great Russian director. He was interested in putting on a production. I think it was only his untimely death that, for some reason, it didn't happen. But this was very much not meant to be a play for Jewish audiences. And I can't say for sure about the film. I know it's a Yiddish film, so you could say, well, how could it have been intended for anything but a Jewish audience? But it's worth checking to see whether, when it first came out, it had subtitles in Polish, for example, because it's absolutely the case that the theatrical versions of the play in the 1920s were very much directed at non-Jewish audiences. There was no sense in which this was a Jewish play for Jewish audiences. Doesn't mean there wasn't tremendous Jewish interest, and the Jews weren't going to the theater and seeing it. But the earliest directors of the play were not Jews. They didn't even understand Yiddish or Hebrew. They say that's one of the reasons, by the way, that so much dialogue was removed from the early rewritings of the play, because the directors didn't understand Jewish languages.
You mentioned Der Golem and then the Dybbuk film. How does the Dybbuk become part of popular culture in the 20th century?
There's no doubt that it is the work of Ansky, the man who wrote the original Dybbuk play, that the film was based on. The screenplay is an adaptation of Ansky's stage play. And I think that it's undoubtedly the case that although Eastern European Jews would have been familiar with the term Dybbuk, and stories circulated and would have been known to people, that the real mainstream popularization of this material comes with the astounding success of Ansky's play from the time of its first productions in the 1920s. It had a kind of explosive impact when it first appeared, and became such a dominant production in both the Hebrew and Yiddish theater worlds that was, according to what I've read at least, it was hard for Yiddish and Hebrew theater companies to even produce other plays. Everybody always wanted to see the Dybbuk. The secret of its success is, of course, interesting to think about. Why did it achieve such tremendous success? But there's no doubt that it did achieve tremendous success and was produced over and over again in Yiddish and in Hebrew, and we have this 1937 Yiddish film produced in Poland on location that obviously until today attracts no small amount of interest, although I'm sure that more people are familiar with the various reboots of the Dybbuk that have been produced in Hollywood and around the world over the last nearly 100 years since then.
And what are some of those, have any of those interested you?
As you mentioned, my academic interest, such as it is in the subject, was always focused on the 16th and 17th century material. And the only reason I began taking an interest in the Dybbuk play, let's say the original cause of, or the original impetus to take a closer look at it was when Israel's main theater company, the Bima Theater that premiered the Dybbuk in the 20s, wanted to do a revival of it about maybe 17, 18 years ago. They called me in as a consultant. I thought it was kind of amusing to think that I could be a consultant to a theater company doing a production of the Dybbuk, and agreed to do it. And this forced me to carefully read the play and try to understand what this was and how it related to my materials. But I very quickly understood that my materials didn't really have that much to do with Ansky's play. And Ansky's play needed a kind of a reading of its own, which I've developed. I mean, I have a kind of a spin on the play that I haven't yet published, but I hope to at some point. That's all to make a short story long. And the short story is, I'm not really an expert on all of the theatrical and film and operatic and ballet reincarnations of the Dybbuk. I mean, I hate to say this, but I think on a podcast it's legit to say, just look up Dybbuk on Wikipedia and, you'll see a list of popular culture reboots of the story. One of my pet peeves has been, since I started looking at Ansky's play, which was written, in the teens of the 20th century, one of my pet peeves has been how the various theatrical and film adaptations have been very cavalier about their treatment of the script. I say that as a person who loves the theater and even had some personal involvement with it, years ago. And I know everybody is allowed to do whatever they want. But, coming at it as someone who, maybe this is the typical complaint of someone who read the book before they saw the movie. But in this case, it's not even exactly a book. It's a play. So what do you do when you take a play and you make a movie out of it? Or it turns out, what do you do when you take a play and just decide to produce it again a few years later? My feeling is, rather than giving the original play a good reading, people have skimmed the surface of it and taken a very superficial story, a kind of forbidden love story, and made a melodramatic episode out of it without really appreciating some of the more interesting, to my mind, elements that are in the original script. To me, the real interest is in the way Ansky created a kind of modern, subversive, heretical myth. Like, he took ancient themes and recast them in a way that nobody seems to have picked up on. So the whole sort of heretical side of the play is very hard to see now when you look at most of these versions of it, including, I'm sorry to say, the film. You don't really get this subversive religious meaning that I think is part of the original story.
In the film, it seems that the person who is interested or practicing Kabbalah is not necessarily a good guy. Is that pretty typical to kind of vilify someone who is into Kabbalah?
No, it's not. And honestly, I don't think that character is meant to be a bad guy. I don't dispute that you can get that impression from looking at the movie, but I'm not sure if that's the only impression that one could get even from the movie. He is a person who, that character, his name is Hanan. He's a person who at a young age has devoted himself to a kind of ascetic piety and devotion to the divine. He's a person who's literally immersed in his whole being in the divine realms. And yet, he falls in love with a beautiful girl. And it turns out, as you find out only later in the play, that before he or the girl were born, their fathers had agreed that if one had a boy and one had a girl, they would marry them off. So they're actually fated to be together, but neither of them knows this at the time, and her father has forgotten the promise, and his father has died. But even bracketing that, Hanan, this protagonist who you got the impression was a bad guy, you could say he's distracted from the divine only by something stronger than his love for God, and that is his love for this young woman. And her name, this is in the movie too, her name is Leah. And I don't know if you caught it, from the subtitles, but at some point in his reveries in the first act of the play, he says, Leah, you can break that word in Hebrew into lo-hey. Leah is spelled in Hebrew, lamed aleph hey, which you can break into two words, lo Hashem, not God. I want the choice that is the not God choice. And I'm going to go all the way now with my choice for the woman. Instead of going to heaven, I want to go to be with this woman. I'm choosing this woman over heaven. And that's what he does. And the whole play is nothing but that in a way. And she also wants that. And they choose each other at the end of the play. In death, they choose to be together. But I don't think any of this comes as a criticism of either of their characters. And most of the readings that you'll see of the play that don't deal with the kind of heretical dimension of it, and that is, in other words, all of the things that you'll ever read about the play until I publish my article, they'll all say, oh, it's about the importance of free love, that people shouldn't have to have arranged marriages, that Ansky was a reformer, and he was a revolutionary, and he was a radical, and this was a way of using traditional sources to make the argument for free love. Of course, nobody who makes that, nobody who offers that interpretation asks themselves why, if that's the case, the whole play is predicated upon the fact that the fathers had already made a deal for the kids to get married, in the future at some point. So to me, it's really secondary. And if you just know one rabbinic legend that bases itself on a biblical narrative from Genesis chapter 6, in which the children of God, the sons of God see the daughters of man and choose them. This is a verse, Genesis 6:2, that doesn't get very elaborated in the Bible, but there's all kinds of intertestamental literature and rabbinic literature about these fallen angels. Basically, what's this kind of original fallen angel? It's an angel. It's a son of God, someone who's already in heaven with God, who sees a woman on the earth and says, you know what? I'm going to go for the girl. Heaven is very nice. It's very sweet. It's very pretty. It's very comfy, but I'm so much more into being with that woman than anything they have to offer in heaven. So, to my mind, if there's a mythical story that's at the core of the Dybbuk, that's the story. And I think that it's really interesting that heresy doesn't originate in the 20th century with Ansky. That's a heresy that's been preserved in ancient Near Eastern literature for over 2,000 years, maybe 3,000 years. We have this idea that you might want to give up heaven for a beautiful girl. The word heresy actually means in Greek choose. You're choosing something else. It's true, you can say that what Ansky brings to it, what the Dybbuk brings to it, is this romantic love that you don't see that so much in Genesis 6, that they have a romantic love, There's a real statement of meaning and purpose and choice in Hanan's pursuit of this not God option and his pursuit of Leah. I think this was an important part of what Ansky was trying to accomplish. And he's not alone in that. Quite a few Jewish writers in the early 20th century tried their hand at creating kind of modern, heretical versions of traditional stories. And in this case, what I'm saying is even in a way more sophisticated, because he's drawing on ancient subversive material that was retained in the tradition. The tradition held on to a subversive teaching like, guess what? Sometimes even angels don't want to be with God. They would rather be with a woman, and he's in a way awakened this ancient myth for the modern reader or the modern theater goer. So I think that's really very powerful. And once you have that clear and you go back and start reading the script, especially the original scripts, it's the earlier versions of the play. I should say, parenthetically at least, that that Ansky probably wrote the play more or less simultaneously in Russian and Yiddish versions, and then it was almost immediately translated into Hebrew by the man who would become Israel's national poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik. And then you have sort of three authentic early expressions of this play, and then you have all of the adaptations subsequently, including the film, the adaptation. But they will, because the people who did the adaptations either didn't see or didn't care about the mythic core of the play, as I understand it, they literally cut out all of the dialogue that makes sense once you understand that Ansky was playing with this subversive motif and this dance with the devil. This is what because so much important dialogue was cut out of the film. Someone like you can watch it and think Hanan is a bad guy. If you would have gotten the full impression from a fuller screenplay or script, you would have known that Hanan is not a bad guy. You'd have, in a way, I should think, sympathy for him. But the caricature that's left after they reduce the play to literally a fraction of its original length and remove so many really pregnant statements by the central characters, it's just you can't even see anything beyond it other than that it's a kind of a theater piece of its time, and everything that implies, romantic mystery with some quaint folkloristic elements.
Tell me more about when your approach to kind of be the consultant for this. What was that experience like for you?
It was interesting and a lot of fun, as I recall. Probably the problem of producing the Dybbuk has only gotten more pronounced over the decades. But I should think that, if you look in the 1937 film, the actors in that film who were playing religious Jews were mostly not religious Jews, but they were living in Poland, where they could not have missed many life experiences with such Jews. They're members of their own families, and who knows where they came from before they wound up in Warsaw. But if you come to Israel in this was in the 1990s, so you have secular Israelis playing religious Jews from 100 years ago or whatever, even if they don't make it in such a period piece. The point is the alienation from the folk life of Eastern European Jewry has only grown with time, and the director of the play, who asked me to consult, was interested in getting my help to make the actors feel like they had some connection to this lost world. He had a few things that he wanted me to do, but one of them was to, for example, to teach old Hasidic chants, musical chants, to these young actors, and to try and get them into the spirit of Hasidism through real experience chanting old kind of Hasidic mystical chants. So that was one of the things that I did with them. As a director, he was also interested in incorporating exorcism techniques into the production. So one of the things that he asked me to do just one-on-one with him was to provide him with a collection of exorcism rituals from which he could choose and that he could dramatize in his new play. And somewhat predictably, I should say now, somewhat predictably, he particularly liked exorcism techniques that had some kind of sexual dimension. So he looked for the most shocking material that I could come up with, and that's exactly the material that he chose to use. I did try at the time to turn him on to my reading of the play and to convince him not to make these draconian cuts in the dialogue of precisely the places that would tip off a sensitive viewer to what's going on a deeper level in the drama, but in that I was wholly unsuccessful. I've yet to see a production of the play that evinces an awareness of this kind of mythical underbelly. And I think that's a shame.
I'm curious to read your article now.
Well, I hope to write it up. I was glad that you asked to speak with me because I thought it would force me to look over my material again. And in about a month and a half, I'll go to Frankfurt, Germany for a conference on monsters in the Jewish tradition. And also thinking that that sort of thing would force me to finally polish my article and send it out for publication. Well, I agreed to do that. So I'm sort of I haven't been working on this stuff for the better part of a decade, but thanks to you and the invitation in Frankfurt, hopefully I'll get back to it and write it up properly and get it out there. That's my hope.
I'd be very curious to know what kind of other Jewish monsters there are.
I'll find out myself, I suppose, when I get to Frankfurt. But for now, the golem is kind of the pre-Frankenstein Frankenstein. I guess the Jews have provided some fodder for modern horror writers willy-nilly. I'll find out if there are any other good monsters when I get to Frankfurt. Dybbuk and Frankenstein, not too bad. I think that there might be some vampires lurking here or there, but I haven't seen any vampires.
So what else are you working on these days?
A few years ago, I decided to take responsibility for making sense of the history of Kabbalistic diagrams. And these are things that, if you pick up any given book on Kabbalah, you'll see the author has used a diagram for the cover of their book, but they'll never tell you what the diagram means, where it's from, what it's diagramming, other than the very simple, tree of life, which is usually just the 10 circles connected by 22 channels that people who've had some exposure to Kabbalah are familiar with. The whole field of Kabbalistic diagrams has been more or less untouched. And it's a whole genre of Kabbalah, of Jewish esotericism. So it's kind of crazy to be in the 21st century and there are hundreds of diagrammatic manuscripts that have never been studied. Nobody knows who made them, why they made them, who they made them for, what, this whole way of relating to the divine. And it has ritual aspects. It certainly goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of our conversation about the objective orientation of Kabbalah. You might say they're kind of maps of divinity. How do you read a map of the divine? How did they do it? And, there's a tremendous amount of variation. And it turns out it's enough material to keep me going as long as I have strength and interest in pursuing it. I have to just ask myself whether that's it for me. Like, now I'm just a Kabbalistic diagram guy now for the next 20 years, or if I'll give it a good run and then I'll move on to something else and just leave it unfinished and let somebody else come along and keep going with it.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about the Dybbuk. Now, Daniel, you mentioned a little bit about the film print itself, and I know there was an attempt at a restoration a few years ago, and I'm wondering if that's where these subtitles that we've been talking about through so much of the discussion came into play, because I don't imagine that this was subtitled maybe at all before the late 90s. Does that sound right to you? Do you think that this was played in English theaters before that?
Well, there's I've not in any detail researched this at all, but remember, of course, the film was designed not just for a domestic audience, but for export as well. So, of course, prints did go abroad. I mean, there was, I think that there certainly was a kind of a print in the National Film Archive in England. And I think the version the video version we're referring to was kind of patched together from various versions and cut downs and kind of, to this kind of 2-hour length. And I think that's when that appeared, sort of, I think, was it 89 or late 80s, early 90s? But nothing's really been done since. And, I've heard nothing concretely, but I think something is underway to kind of do something with it. Certainly the version I saw at the Filmoteca Narodowa was the best version I'd seen, but of course it was completely... I'm not even sure it was even subtitled in Polish. I think it was the Lector, if I remember. It was a few years ago.
Yeah, I love the New York Times article by Richard Shepard where he describes the film as it is a triumph of persistence that has assembled this 1937 film from pieces as mauled and scattered about the globe as the people for whom it was made to be seen.
Oh, wow.
Just very nice nice description of the film print, as well as what happened to so many of the people that were involved in this and so much of their audience as well.
Yeah, that's still so crazy to me. That becomes a factor in the movie, even though the movie was not predicting it necessarily, but surely it was kind of hovering over their consciousness at the time.
Well, I think it's like the scene with the grave of the houses. It's always been subject to pogroms and persecution, so it just but it is a great metaphor. I mean, this idea of being between two worlds. I mean, even in terms of the Polish context, you're between kind of Yiddish speaking community and a Polish community. Kind of Judaism and Catholicism, or in the case of Ansky, kind of the Russian Empire, and so it's. And then, of course, now, I mean, you've got this whole situation now. It's sort of in Poland. Okay, how do you conceive of Poland? How do you conceive of Jews? Because, of course, the communities represented and who made the film are not assimilated. They're Polish Jewish. So how do you think about these things? How do you think about these films? Because I think one of the interesting things about the way that the Dybbuk has been written about, it's always in the context of Yiddish language cinema, which is perfectly understandable. But I would like to see more. I would like to see it in an overview of Polish cinema. So if there was anything else like the Polish classics, I would like to see a film like the Dybbuk and some of the avant-garde films of the 20s included as well. Because Poland isn't just films against communism in black and white, or with a kind of a deathly kind of Catholic lecturing tone. It's actually fantastic. It can be fantastic, and I think certainly the films which not just myself, but I think a lot of people have gravitated towards, whether it's Żuławski's films, whether it's Borowczyk or Wojciech Haas, they are fantastic in terms of their interest in, whether it's Polanski with The Devil or Down to the Vampires or Haas, which, of course, the Sanatorium Under the Hourglass is based on Bruno Schulz, who, of course, is Jewish and who died during the war. So, of course, it would be nice to kind of reconceive, I think, Polish cinema as having these aspects as well.
Well, it's interesting, the whole idea of the Yiddish cinema, and just, even though this was made in Poland, that it wasn't necessarily a Polish language film, that it was made in the language that it could be exported in for more people to see it than just Poles.
Well, that reflects the ethnic makeup of Poland at the time, and the fact that there were 3.5 million more people to see that film than there were 10 years later.
God, it's so depressing when you say it that way.
Yeah.
For good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Genuinely depressing.
It's been interesting, when I'm out there and I'm looking for articles about the Dybbuk or, things about Dybbuks themselves, and I keep running across these. Well, more than anything, I've been running across some sort of paranormal TV show where it's one of these like ghost story shows, and they're doing, the reenactments of what happened and all this. And it all has to do with this thing called a Dybbuk box, which I don't know if it's more of a modern convention, but it feels like it's kind of captured people's imaginations lately, where somebody buys it's such a typical thing. Somebody buys a box and now I think it's on eBay. They buy a box on eBay. It's supposed to be this heirloom or whatever, and then it ends up having an evil spirit inside of it. And now it's like, so there are many interpretations of the story, both on TV and now in movies. And I want to say that the Possession movie that John, did you mention that earlier? Or was that you, Danielle?
No, I mentioned it kind of I was saying that when I was watching this movie and I was thinking like, I saw that film existed, and I used it as a comparison for just how like hackneyed it felt compared to this. Even though the movie, The Possession, is from 2012, and the Dybbuk is, like you said, almost 80 years old. The Dybbuk is still a better treatment of the idea.
Well, there was one interesting film from last year, a Polish film, a Polish-Israeli co-production called Demon by Marcin Wrona. Unfortunately, it was his last film. It wasn't based on the Ansky play, but it kind of used the kind of Dybbuk as a kind of a plot device, and it tells the story. It's familiar of a guy from London who ends up going to Poland to marry a Polish girl, and he's to inherit a house from the girl's father, and then they find a skull in the garden, and then during the kind of the wedding, he gets possessed by the spirit of the murdered girl, and that film is interesting because it tries to combine, not entirely successfully, but it's interesting nevertheless, the kind of the shock devices of the modern horror we're talking about, with a kind of a more kind of a social satire, almost farce and comedy. Again, just like the way that the play and the film is this kind of mashup of various genres. I mean, this film as well is a kind of, it's got a strong ominous atmosphere, some shocks with some sort of social comedy scenes. Sometimes it works, sometimes it cancels each other out, but it is an interesting kind of a third way between these two poles of this more classical horror with this kind of more modern horror.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned a man being possessed by a woman's spirit, I'm just like, oh, like All of Me with Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin.
You put Edwina back in ball. Back in ball. Edwina back in ball. Horrifying.
Daniel, you seem to be a little bit more aware of the play and just like the history of the lore. I was wondering how this movie felt, because I read up on it as much as I could, and I did find some sort of scholarly approaches where people were saying that this film represents a dumbing down of the themes of the play, and that the play itself is a subversion of the actual meaning of the Dybbuk in folklore. And I didn't know if maybe you do, Mike, as well. Do either of you have an impression of, does this movie in 1937, would it have felt like a very modern film, simplified version of this lore and these ideas, or would it have felt like it sort of pays respect to the complications in the play, and then the fact that the play itself is, like I said, a subversion of something from folklore that itself had a kind of subversive side to it?
Well, the first thing everybody always says, that the film is not as good as the book, or in this case, the play. I mean, it's the default position to signal that you've read something and they haven't. But in terms of the film itself, I think that it's very it's different from the play in as much as it has this whole section at the beginning in which the whole backstory is filmed and filled in, which is not in the play. At the same time, of course, the play is kind of filleted, as you would expect, into more filmic language. But I think that the way it's actually done. I mean, I'm not an expert, but having read the play and watched the film, I mean, I see them as two different kind of genres, and I think that the process of adapting one to the other was done sensitively and intelligently. But in terms of the actual play itself, I mean, remember, it's not like some ancient tale, which is just it's a synthesis. I mean, it was written, when did Ansky? When was the play? I think the play was only kind of staged about 100 years ago. So it was basically.
I want to say it was 1905.
Yeah. So basically, that process of actually kind of going into all the shtetls at the time and actually listening and like an anthropologist and what goes on and what people talk about, and then actually recording it. I mean, there are actually. It's actually certainly published. There's a kind of a report of kind of Rappaport or Ansky's kind of expeditions at the time. So you can actually, and there's a really good in terms of actually looking at how the play evolves. There's a book by Joachim Neugroschall who talks about how Tony Kushner asked him to retranslate the Dybbuk for like a play which he was going to kind of readapt. And as part of his research, he started to kind of look at all of those tales from various sources. And he actually published a book which actually puts his translation of the play alongside all of those kind of other stories which may or may not have fed into the play. So I think that that's certainly a good place to start.
Yeah, there are a lot of interpretations of the play in different forms. I know that I listened to a radio version of it, back from, I'm trying to remember what year that is played. I want to say 1974. And Sidney Lumet had directed a version for television. The one thing that I found fascinating was to find that George Gershwin almost did an adaptation of it, but he couldn't get the rights, so they ended up making Porgy and Bess instead, which, talk about different material. But yeah, it's been very popular over the years, and yeah, even our guest this week had a hand in a new adaptation of it. So it's still being staged and still being reinterpreted. So it's good that this drama from 1905 still has the legs that it had. It's not just it's not a dead art by any means.
Not at all. I mean, it's certainly there's in the Jewish theatre in Warsaw. I mean, it is part of the kind of their standard program, and it's still kind of being staged.
Well, I think a lot of that goes to what was said earlier. I think, John, you said it as far as this being such a good tragedy, and this whole idea of us being able to see as an audience that moment where tragedy could be avoided, but instead, Sender still makes that mistake again and ends up choosing the more wealthy bridegroom for his daughter. And it's just one of those classic moments for me where it's just like, and you wish you could, change history and change the play as it's going on, but no, it'll always be that way, and we'll always see the same tragedy play itself over and over again. We're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
When Detective Smith was called backstage to investigate the Inwood murder, it looked like a rather routine affair. He hardly expected it to lead to the most dangerous adventure of his life, romance. The case presented a few clues and a few bodies. A very dead body, a very heavenly body, a very suspicious body, and finally a very charming busybody who started out by getting tangled in the strings of the mystery and finished by getting tied up in the strings of his heart.
Taking all the trouble to protect my reputation, covering up the accident, destroying that dreadful dress.
I didn't destroy it.
So long as I have the dress, I'm the one who decides how long this show will run. And everything else. Do you understand?
You fool! There goes evidence that could have helped you.
Oh, you're not to say things against Charlotte. I'm doing all this for her sake. You're just jealous of her.
Let them say, if they like, it's satirical.
This sounds to me remarkably like blackmail. I think I better call the police.
Yes, do call the police, Miss Imwood. We'll talk to them together.
Who are you?
That's right. We will be back next week with a look at Alfred Hitchcock's Stage Fright. Before we go, I want to thank this week's special guest co-hosts, Jeff and Daniel. Daniel, what have you been working on lately? You're always into some fascinating areas of cinema.
Well, the last couple of months, I was working on some restorations of Andrzej Żuławski's Polish films, which were presented at Lincoln Center in February, particularly on the Silver Globe. So, of course, that was sad, obviously, because, of course, Żuławski was ill at the time and passed away. I think it was the same day I actually flew out to New York, which was just terrible timing. At the same time, it was great to have those films restored and to actually have for him to see them and to know that they were restored, particularly during the final weeks. In fact, the last time I saw him, it was the day before he kind of got really sick, and it was to basically to see the kind of final graded version of the Silver Globe, and and it was that, of course, was sad, but at the same time, it was also surrealistic because I never thought I would actually get to see on the Silver Globe in a kind of a good version on the screen, and that was the last project, and so tomorrow I'm going to the UK to. There's a little Żuławski focus as part of the Polish Film Festival in London, and there's Screening Cosmos along with Possession, Lampo Tansademe, and The Devil. So it's the first time The Devil has been screened publicly in England. So that's what I'm doing next week.
Yeah, I want to cover on the Silver Globe next year. Would you be up for coming back?
For sure.
All right, awesome. And how about you, John? What have you been up to lately?
Well, for a long time, I've been one of the three people hosting a movie conversation podcast called Movie Schmovie, and that is something that comes out at least every other Friday, sometimes more often than that. It's not quite the curated discussion that this show is, but we talk a lot about current films, and so we get to kind of gripe about a lot of these modern tropes, and that's a lot of fun. I also am in a band called Rosemary Stretch. You can find our stuff on Bandcamp at rosemarystretch.bandcamp.com. And I promise I'm going to start using my Twitter feed more effectively. So if anybody wants to catch up on the general roster of projects that I might finally get out the door, you can find me on Twitter at Gianni W. That's GIANNIDUBYA. So that should be enough, right?
Sounds good to me, and I will definitely be sure to link over to that over at our website, projection-booth.com. Come on over. You can find out even more about this week's episode, as well as finding links over to our iTunes page where you can rate and review the show, or come on over to our Patreon page where you can donate a few bucks to help the show. Until next week, I will just be counting money.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.